Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us here. I'm Brien McElhatten. Let's go inside Utah politics now. Utah state leaders are making a plea to take control of nearly 20 million acres of federal land in our state. The state filed a lawsuit with the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping to take control of unappropriated federal public lands in the state. And it marks the latest jab in a running feud between the states and the federal government over who should control major parts of the West and the enormous oil, gas, timber, and other resources they contain. Federal agencies combined have jurisdiction over almost 70% of Utah.
We've been asking and asking and asking, and not only are they not willing to negotiate or help on this at all, it's the exact opposite. It's just not only no, but hell no, and we're going to close more of your roads and make it harder on you.
Utah's world-famous national parks, the national monuments managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the Park Service, etc., would remain in federal hands under the lawsuit. We should point that out. Now, joining us today to weigh in on the issue, we have Utah Senator Mike Lee. Senator, welcome back to Inside Utah Politics. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much.
So first things first, tell us your thoughts on this lawsuit here this week.
This is a very well-pled lawsuit. The state's well represented by Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes, other members of his office, and by former U.S. Solicitor General Paul Clement, arguably the top living U.S. Supreme Court advocate, who agreed to take this case. And it makes a compelling case in the brief and complaint submitted yesterday to the Supreme Court of the United States that with respect to the land that is not national park, that is not national recreation area, national forest, or declared wilderness, or one of these other congressionally designated areas, the garden variety Bureau of Land Management managed land, referred to in the brief and in the complaint as unappropriated lands. This is sort of the garden variety sagebrush land that's out there. The federal government doesn't have the right to just own it just for the sake of letting it sit. And that at some point there's got to be a plan to dispose of that land by the federal government. And look, they make compelling arguments rooted in history, rooted in the Constitution, and in statute as to why Utah is entitled to relief.
Now, you are Utah's senior senator. You represent our state there in the Senate. And I wonder, have you had any conversations about how this could have happened, how these conversations with the federal government could have happened without going down the route of a lawsuit?
Look, these arguments have been made behind closed doors for a very long time. The U.S. government has no interest in abandoning its current approach because the status quo for the U.S. government, for the Bureau of Land Management, puts it in a very powerful position. It's by far the largest landowner in Utah and arguably the most powerful entity in Utah. And so, yeah, they've got no interest in simply agreeing to resolve this because the status quo benefits them.
Now, you've got a legal background, including Supreme Court cases. In your experience, knowing what you know, how do you think the Supreme Court would approach this if it accepts the lawsuit?
Okay, so the state of Utah is availing itself of the benefits of Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2, which is part of what's called the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, because the state of Utah is a state, a sovereign state, and it's bringing this action against the United States government. It's entitled to file the lawsuit in the first instance in the Supreme Court. Normally, one goes about filing litigation. If it's a federal case in a federal district court, it winds its way through the district court. After the district court has rendered its judgment, you take it up to the circuit court, which is a court of appeals. And then and only then do you seek review by the Supreme Court. This one gets filed in the U.S. Supreme Court itself. I suspect what's going to happen is that they're likely to appoint what's called a special master. The Supreme Court is not well equipped to conduct discovery, conduct a full trial. And so they'll probably outsource that to a court-appointed expert called the special master, who will do the fact-finding and the gathering and oversee any discovery that might need to be done. But I think the state of Utah is very well positioned here. These are arguments that have not been raised, have not been squarely presented to the Supreme Court in the past, and very much need to be.
What are you hearing from your colleagues who represent other states and the effect this might have in their states?
Look, my colleagues, particularly Republicans, But my colleagues generally, who are from Western states, understand that this is a problem. They have different approaches on how they go about it, on how they would go about solving it, but they agree that it's a problem. When a state like ours has close to 70% of the land in the state owned by the U.S. government, and in Utah, about half of that is neither national park, national wilderness area, national forest, or fitting into any of these other designations. It just fits into this loose, broad category of unappropriated federal lands. People agree that that chills all kinds of things, from economic activity to job growth, job creation. It also suppresses the amount of tax revenue going into our units of local government, and that impairs our ability to fund all kinds of things, from education to search and rescue, police, and pretty much across the board, the state of Utah suffers from it. So look, people from throughout the West get this problem because in Western states, the federal government is a huge landowner. Interestingly enough, in basically every state, almost every state east of Colorado, the federal government owns very little land, like less than 10% in almost every instance. And in most cases, it's in the low single digits. But in every state from Colorado's East Bench westward, the federal government is a huge landowner, the biggest landowner by far. And all of these states suffer from that immensely. And so they understand something needs to be done.
I want to ask you about this. You've been behind several pieces of legislation regarding access to public lands. I'm thinking about the way vehicles can move in and out of public lands. Let me ask you this. Were those inspired by constituents or by federal action?
Both, by constituents in response to federal action. So, for example, I'm pushing legislation that you may be referring to. It would make it easier for disabled persons to have access to federal land. Certain federal lands have all kinds of restrictions on them. You can't do anything on them. You can't even utilize a human-powered vehicle for mountain biking. You can't operate a powered wheelchair in many circumstances. So we're trying to expand access by Utahns, by the American people, to lands that they themselves own.
I want to ask you about this now, because this is one public lands issue that this state deals with. Another point of contention between Utah and the federal government has been Bears Ears, for example. We've heard so much about that over the years. What's your idea for how Utah and the federal government should work together? In your ideal of ideals, how does that relationship work?
Yeah, so the designation of a national monument should be something that Congress ought to approve, Congress ought to enact. Now, over 110 years ago, Congress passed a law called the Antiquities Act, giving the President of the United States the power unilaterally to designate a national monument and thereby put that land in a particularly restrictive category. Now, at the time it was created, it was believed and understood that the Antiquities Act would be used only to designate relatively narrow, confined spaces. Instead, we have two national monuments that have been declared. In both instances, when they were declared by Democratic presidents, it was done against the strong opposition of statewide and local elected officials. And those monuments put together take up more land than twice the size of the state of Delaware. So it's my belief that we ought to reform the Antiquities Act. Ideally, none of those monuments should be created without the state's consent, or at least without Congress enacting it. At a bare minimum, Utah ought to have the benefit of what I call the Or Utah solution. The Or Utah solution would add Utah to a list of two other states, Wyoming and Alaska, that have effectively been exempted from future presidential designations of national monuments under the Antiquities Act. Utah has had more than enough of national monuments declared by presidents against the will of the local voters, and it shouldn't happen anymore.
Our time is running short, but I do want to ask you one final question here. Back to the idea of transferring these federal lands to Utah control. There are critics who say, look, this is going to open up land to development, to privatization, and they don't like that. They feel very strongly that that shouldn't happen. How do you answer those critics?
Look, I totally get it with respect to our crown jewels, our national parks, national recreation areas, national forests. declared wilderness areas. I totally get that. This lawsuit doesn't even seek to address those. It doesn't even touch them. It recognizes that they're in place, they've been designated. This is talking about an entirely different category of land. About half of the federal land in Utah fits into this category of unappropriated land. It's just sitting there. And in most instances, it can't be accessed, it can't be used. And the impediment is itself severely chilling economic activity to the state. It's reducing tax revenue going to the state that the state and its schools need. And it is the federal government's obligation to take care of this. Think of it this way. Utah is subject to an impairment that basically no state east of Colorado faces. States are supposed to be admitted into the union on an equal footing, one with another. We and other states in the West have been deprived of that. This lawsuit will remedy it.
Senator Mike Lee, this is something we are going to be watching very closely. I know you are too, and I'm sure we'll talk again. We appreciate your time today. Thanks so much. Still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, auditing Utah's election processes, what the state's top oversight office will be looking for, and how the candidates are responding to it. And one of Ukraine's largest attacks on Russia yet, how the U.S. is counseling the country moving forward. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the U.S. without the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas the U.S. had hoped to broker. As war continues in Gaza now, tensions at home continue to simmer too. Our Washington correspondent Jesse Tenor reports on the impact on the DNC and beyond.
Time is of the essence.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken left the Middle East with no ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Blinken blamed Hamas for the holdup.
We are going to do everything possible to, one, get Hamas on board with the bridging proposal.
Back home in the U.S., pro-Palestinian protesters are losing their patience.
A danger to our city.
Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling says officers arrested at least 55 protesters on the second night of the Democratic National Convention.
They showed up with the intent on committing acts of violence, vandalism.
Other protests around the DNC remain peaceful. Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush is one of the protesters demanding a permanent ceasefire and arms embargo.
It's heartbreaking to have to plead for the safety of children.
Some protesters have quietly tried to get that message inside the DNC, but a Michigan delegate was escorted out of President Joe Biden's speech Monday night.
We held up the banner during Biden's speech because he's the decider.
The president was one of the few speakers to address the issue on stage.
Those protesters out in the street, they have a point. A lot of innocent people are being killed.
Florida Congressman Mike Waltz, a Republican, is also in Chicago and says Democrats will suffer the consequences of their division on this issue in November.
That's going to be reflected, especially with Jewish American voters in the polls.
In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
The state auditor's office is looking into how some of Utah's election processes work this year. They specifically want to know how the state handled voter information and verified signatures some candidates used to qualify for the primary. It seems to be a way to address complaints from Governor Spencer Cox's primary challenger, Phil Lyman, who has questioned Cox's signature gathering process. Governor Cox and several other candidates requested the audit earlier this week, something Lyman called a smokescreen. The Davis County Clerk's Office, which verified the Cox campaign signatures, they tell us they welcome the audit. There's still no word, though, on how long that review could last. But of course, we'll keep you updated right here on IUP. Lawmakers heard Rocky Mountain Power's case for why they'd like to charge Utahns more for electricity soon. They're asking to raise rates by just over 30% by 2026. A company spokesperson cited inflation as one of the reasons for that request. But that's not sitting well with some customers who say their power bills are already too high. They're asking the company to make budget cuts instead of passing those higher costs to customers.
For your average user, average customer, it would be a $24.14 increase over 2 years, so $10 and change in the first year, $13 and change in the second year.
They'll get phase one, oh boy, it went up like 11% or something, and then phase two comes along. It's like a frog that's in a pan of water, and it's getting a little hotter, a little hotter, a little hotter until we get fried.
Well, the Utah Public Service Commission still has to approve the rate increase. For that to happen, we're told that process typically takes anywhere from 6 to 8 months. We'll keep our eyes on that for you. We are now weeks into the largest attack on Russia since World War II. Ukraine managed to launch an aerial attack on the Russian capital of Moscow. The U.S. reportedly asked Ukraine to consider the long-term goals here. Our Washington correspondent Vinay Simlat has the latest.
Ukrainian forces now occupy a portion of the Kursk region of Russia. It's the result of the largest attack on Russia since World War II.
Generally speaking, though, Russia has really struggled to respond.
The Ukrainian president says the goal is to create a buffer zone on the border to prevent future Russian attacks on Ukraine. Ukraine's military says it has seized multiple villages and destroyed bridges. Russian state media claims Ukraine's attack killed 17 people.
It has certainly demonstrated the creativity and the battlefield prowess of the Ukrainians.
The Russian government says Ukraine's invasion has ended any possibility of peace negotiations to end the war, which began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022. On Tuesday, at a meeting with mothers of victims of terrorism, Russian President Vladimir Putin said, with the attack on Kursk, Ukraine is trying to destabilize our country. The Ukrainian president said in a video posted on X, his military is achieving its goals. Ukraine's attacks on Russia continued overnight. Moscow's mayor says Russian air defense systems shot down 45 Ukrainian drones that were headed to the Russian capital. In Washington, I'm Vinay Simlat.
Coming up, amending the state constitution, we dive into how the legislature wants to change the ballot initiative process and what it means for the election. Welcome back, everyone. The House and the Senate have both passed the resolution for voters to decide on amending the state constitution in a special session of the legislature. The amendment would override a Utah Supreme Court ruling and allow lawmakers more leeway to modify laws passed by other ballot initiatives. It comes after the court found that the legislature may have overstepped in repealing a ballot initiative from 2018 to have Utah's legislative maps drawn by an independent committee. State Republicans say it would avoid confusion in court battles in the future, while Democrats are calling it overreach.
It's really weird that they didn't define that and give us a definition of what our Constitution said. Maybe they don't know what it is, but we don't have a good definition of altering form.
It's really an attempt to limit the constitutional rights of Utah voters. There's no other reason to make this retroactive. We had a good discussion on that. We are patronizing our constituents.
Now, the Senate passed the resolution with 20 votes in favor, 8 opposing votes, while more than 2/3 of the House voted to approve the amendment, and only 21 lawmakers voted against it. So joining us today to dig into some of the implications here of this amendment, we have Matthew Brogdon. He's the Senior Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. So glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be with you, Brian.
Okay, so let's talk about this amendment that legislatures are putting on the ballot in November. Voters are going to decide on this now. If it's passed by the voters, how does this change the relationship between the lawmakers and the voters?
Well, the argument of advocates is that it will restore the status quo. In about 21 states in the United States have voter-initiated statutes. In 11 of those, including Utah, there's no restraint on the legislature's ability to repeal or alter those initiated statutes once they've been voted on. The Supreme Court's opinion, of course, places a restraint on the legislature's ability to do that. So advocates argue this is returning us to the status quo with the other 10 or so states that have unrestrained legislators in this respect.
Okay, so you said 21 states have a ballot initiative mechanism of some kind. But they're not all the same, right? They vary.
No. As I said, 11, including Utah, don't put any restraint on the legislature. 2 actually prohibit the legislature from repealing any kind of ballot initiative. That's California and Arizona. They have to go back to their voters if they want to change the ballot initiative. The other 8 actually have some sort of impediment, but not prohibition to legislative change. In some states, that's a supermajority of the legislature is required to significantly alter or repeal the initiative. In some states, it's a time requirement. The legislature has to wait a certain period of time before they can act.
So the legislators that are for this here in Utah, they're essentially saying, look, we need something written down, codified, everyone can see it, giving us the authority to amend these ballot initiatives. Whereas the critics are saying, so you heard it right there, government overreach, right? Is there any nuance being lost here? I mean, talk to me about the arguments you're hearing.
I think it's a very significant issue. It's much larger than Utah. The founding generation that wrote our Constitution was quite allergic to this kind of direct democracy. Someone like a James Madison would have argued, representative democracy means you put representatives in government and they do the legislating on your behalf. They execute the laws on your behalf.
And J. Stewart Adams has basically said the same thing.
Well, this is what critics of initiative processes and direct democracy processes in general argue. Yeah. It really wasn't until about 1900, Utah was one of 2 states initially in 1900 to adopt a mode of direct legislation where the people could draft and enact legislation without the involvement of their elected representatives. This is a very significant innovation and really a return to direct democracy. So really what we've done, initiative processes really erect a parallel legislative process so that you have the state legislature, which is representative democracy, it's very familiar to us, and then a direct democracy where the people can legislate directly. Now, the complexity comes in the relationship between these two. If they're both co-equal legislatures, well, usually legislatures can repeal their own actions. One legislature can repeal the law passed by a previous one. So if these are really just 2 embodiments of the legislative power, then the one that's most authoritative is the one that acted most recently. So that was the status quo. Now in practice, as it plays out quite often, if you get an initiative that is pushing for something a majority wants, but the legislature is resistant to, what you quite often wind up with, and this is not just in Utah but elsewhere, is something of a negotiation. The legislature winds up pursuing the basic policy objective, but moderating it, altering it in some way that makes it more palatable to the legislature. So there's not really a great deal of certainty about who will win the battle between the initiative and the legislature if you just leave the question open and treat them as co-equals.
What are you going to be watching for as the voters make up their minds on this issue in November?
I'm very curious if we have a larger conversation about the wisdom of direct democracy. That was a very vibrant debate in the United States right up into the progressive era when we started adopting these kinds of procedures. And we've had extensive experience with it now. 21 states have initiative processes. Many more have a process for people, the people, to propose amendments to their constitution, which is, of course, a much more authoritative act than a mere initiated statute. And I think we're due for a debate about how this ought to work. I think it's also healthy that we work out this dynamic. What should be the relationship and dynamic between initiated statutes and the legislature when those two are at odds, or perhaps just see things a little bit differently?
That conversation playing out now, civics for everybody. We're watching it happen. Matthew Brogdon, I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And I do hope we'll talk to you again soon. Sure. Thank you. Hey, stay with us, everybody. More Inside Utah Politics coming up right after this. All right, everyone, that does it for today's edition of Inside Utah Politics. Don't forget, if you have any local political stories you'd like to see, make sure to reach out to us. You can email InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow along with me on social media, on X @Brien Reports, and on Instagram. Just search for Brien McElhatten. And find ABC4 on social media, too, to follow along no matter where you are. And while you're at it, why don't you download the ABC4 News app? We're always on, headlines in your pocket whenever you'd like. Thanks so much for being with us, everybody. We'll see you right back here next week.